It is my honor to introduce to you the first keynote speaker of the meeting. Okay. Professor Persson is a well-known scholar, especially in the area of political economy and macroeconomic policy. Now, let me give you a brief account of Professor Persson's CV. Okay, have to be very brief because I received his CV is almost 20 pages. So even I read it to you, it may take 20 minutes. Okay, but since we are overrun already, so we'll try to be very, very brief. Now, first of all, Professor Persson is the Swedish Research Council Distinguished Professor, okay, of the Institute for International Economic Studies. And he's also the Centennial Professor of the London School of Economics. Okay. And let me select it to inform you about his past positions. And the most important one is he was the president of the Econometric Society back in 2008, okay, and is also the president, okay, of the European Economic Association in 2003. Okay. And the last but not the least that I want to highlight is actually Professor Persson is the chair of the prize committee or the Alfred Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Science. Okay, so very important one. And he's also currently serving as the secretary at the moment for the committee. Okay. Now, today Professor Persson is going to talk with us one of his main research area for the more than 2 decades. Okay. Whoever has been working in this area, I think in the profession, would not be unfamiliar, okay, with Professor Persson's work in the field. Okay. However, there's one thing you may not notice is in the early stage of Professor Persson, he's working on exchange rate dynamics, okay, which really back in the past. Why I remember that? Because when I was working on my dissertation, I had a hard time reading his work with Swenson on the Haberger-Lawson-Messler effect. Okay, so this is a small episode, okay, which is a hard memory for myself. Anyway, let's have Professor Persson to give us the lecture on the first keynote with the title, Who Becomes a Politician? Okay. So please join me and give a big hand to Professor Persson to kick off the meeting.
Thank you. Do you hear me? Well, thank you very much for that introduction. It's the kind of thing you want your mother to hear, and she might even believe it. So, all right. So, what I'm going to present today is a paper which is part of a larger project on politics. It has various co-authors. The present paper has 2 co-authors from Sweden, Olle Folke and Johanna Rickne, and 2 from Berkeley, Ernesto Dalbo and Fred Pinan. And as the title suggests, it's about selection in politics. So why should we worry about selection in politics? I think it's key to the working not only of democracy, but of all political systems. The task of the political system is to aggregate information into public policy and to aggregating potentially conflicting interests into public policy. And we like to believe that the more competent the politicians, the more able are the politicians, the better they'll solve any given policy problem. So hence a focus on ability. If you know the jury theorem of Condorcet, you'd also think that politicians with a broad background might be better suited to aggregating information into public policy. But from the viewpoint of us as a collective, we like to think that if a broader set of interests is represented, then they will be balanced in a better way against each other, at least from a sort of a veil of ignorance point of view. So the $10,000 question is whether the political selection process can select both able, competent politicians and broadly representative politicians. And there's no shortage of theoretical hypotheses on this issue. In fact, the literature is full of it. But I would say that the issue is empirically under-researched, and that's where we're going with this lecture. Let me first give you some influential ideas from the literature. So already sort of key political economists such as V.O. Key and Mansur Olson thought that phenomena such as free riding and high opportunity cost might actually lead us to expect that there would be a negative selection into politics. Good people have better things to do, and therefore they do something in the private sector rather than being engaged in the political sector. They had the south of the US in mind in particular. Now there's a resurgence of papers more recently. I've just written a few here, which more has Italy in mind, Italian last names, and they sort of maintain the same issue. So in the theory, in political economics, there's actually a presumption that politicians might be negatively selected from the population. Of course, we know that there are not only opportunity costs, there are also intrinsic motivations, and that may serve as a counterweight. But it's an empirical issue. Now, there is also in political science, there is one of the big ideas in political science is that electoral systems might entail a trade-off between different objectives. So systems based on plurality, such as the English one or the US one, may be good at holding politicians accountable. And if accountability, individual accountability is linked to ability, they may be good at selecting able people, although recent events may make us doubt that. But these systems may not be so good at finding a broad representation of people. On the other hand, European type systems such as proportional representation may be good at representation, but worse at accountability, and therefore there may be a trade-off. That's also like an idea. There are many empirical hurdles when you want to study political selection, and I would say that even the best work in the area suffers from these empirical problems. So one is that you work with selected samples. So there's a beautiful paper by Diermeier et al. On dynamic discrete choice in politics, but it starts from a sample where everyone has already become a congressman, and that's a highly selected sample, right? How do you measure ability? How do you measure social background? Many people have tried to approximate ability by things like education, but if you do that, are you measuring ability or are you measuring social background? Not so clear, right? And then finally, there are really no studies that compares politicians and the full population or other elite groups. There's a Philip Tillman's PhD dissertation from Chicago a couple of years ago took some steps in that direction, but there's really no work like this. So, which is what we'd like to do. So to give you an idea, there's a recent paper that some of you may know by Rai Chetty, who will speak later here in the conference, with John van Reenen and others, on the selection and family backgrounds of US innovators. So what we'd like to do is to do something similar for politicians. And that's what we do, but with a little bit better data than Chetty et al. So this is, I think, the first comprehensive study, empirical study of political selection. So we will look at the universe of politicians in Sweden. So in the sample, will there be any person who has been on any ballot in any party in any election since 1982. And for these people, I will show you detailed measures of ability, actually 3 different measures of ability, as well as a couple of measures of social background. And we will compare those abilities and social backgrounds, both to the full population and to specific elite professions. So just so you know where I'm going, here are the main questions that we address in the study and the main answers that I will try to convince you. So the first question is, does selection of politicians favorability, or do we see negative selection as VOP and others hypothesized? The answer is going to be selection, at least in Sweden, during this period, did favorability, and monotonically so in political power, i.e. people with higher political power are more able than those with lower power. Now, does this selection reflect elitism, the elite just reproducing itself, or is there an aspect of meritocracy? The answer, by and large, is going to be, it looks like meritocracy. On the question of representation, of social background, do politicians represent the full population? The answer is basically going to be yes. We may wonder about trade-offs. So, if you have a worse representation of social backgrounds, is that maybe associated with better ability or the other way around? We'll see a trade-off that is qualitatively there, but quantitatively unimportant. So up to this point is basically going to be analytical description. I think we have too little description in the profession and too much analysis. But we will do a little bit of analysis and look for drivers behind the patterns in the data that we see. And we'll see that there are both clear forces of self-selection and party screening that lie behind these results. So my roadmap is to give you a little bit of background and tell you a little bit about the data. Then we're going to approach these questions in turn. So first the selection on ability, the meritocracy question, the question about the trade-off, and then addressing the drivers. So let me first give you one piece of background. You'll see a little bit, or quite a bit, about Swedish municipal politicians. So that's the lowest level of political jurisdiction in Sweden. You may think, who is interested in Swedish municipalities, unimportant garbage collection and all of that. So that's really not the case. It is the lowest level of political organization, but there are about 300 of these units. So that means it's an average population of 35,000. Not very large, but they have important responsibilities. So, they are the legal providers of all social services. So daycare, all schools, old age care are in the hands of municipalities as this local infrastructure. So this means that these units sort of represent 20% of the economy. So they turn over about a fifth of GDP, a fifth of employment. It's financed with an income tax rate around 20%. So Sweden is not a federation, but these are very independent economic units. They're also politically independent. So you can think about each one of these municipalities as working like a mini parliamentary system. So there is a council, that's like a parliament, which is elected by proportional representation from local party lists. And these lists have been chosen locally by the parties who are active in the municipality. The election is held every 4 years. It's synchronized with national elections, which means that it's 80 to 90% turnout. So this is representation in a meaningful sense of the word. Now there are 7 or 8 parties in each municipality, so a coalition will have to be formed. That coalition appoints the council board, which is like the cabinet. It dominates the committees, and it proposes the budget. So it works like a parliamentary system. And then the top politician in the largest majority party becomes the mayor, who is the prime minister, so to speak, of the municipality. Now, people who work in politics in municipalities are, in Swedish, they're called leisure politicians. So that means that they are part-time. So they don't have a full salary. They're reimbursed for costs and meetings. So in Stockholm, even the largest municipality, the council meeting is held on Thursdays at 3 o'clock. So you have to leave your work and go to to the meeting, and if you're in a committee, you will go another afternoon, and you'll get reimbursed for that. So, is this meaningful to study such sort of part-time politicians? I think it is. And in fact, many legislators around the world work on a part-time basis. Even in the US, at least a quarter of the state legislators are part-time legislators. So it's much more common than we might first think. Anyway, it may be that having a seat in the council of one of these municipalities is a stepping stone for bigger aims, such as national politics. And about 1% of the people who serve in the council at one point or another take a step to national politics. So it's a relatively rare event, but it can happen. Now the mayor, the top politician in each municipality, is an important person. That person certainly has a full-time salary. The salary is typically large enough to put you in the upper 1% of the Swedish income distribution. And of course, on top of that, you have a lot of power over policy, and you have a lot of local prestige. So let me now tell you about our data. So we're going to link up information from a variety of sources. And the key starting point are the party ballots that have to be approved by the election authority. And the key is that these ballots come with a personal ID number. So after ethical approval from the appropriate ethics committee, we are able to link those personal ID numbers to information from a lot of national registers. So from the Statistics Sweden, we have census data as well as tax data for the whole population, including these politicians from the early 80s and onwards. So that's information on age, gender, education, occupation, earnings, etc. We will also be interested, as you will see soon, in family relations. So we don't have to make guesses about common last names or anything like that. We just go to the family register, which tells you who is a cousin with whom. So we know that too. And when we're thinking about ability, we'll be making use of unique data from the Swedish Defense Recruitment Agency that have tested all 18-year-old men in the obligatory sort of military draft. So we will know the mental capacities of at least the male part of the population. So these are reasonably large data sets. Since we have 30 cohorts of population data for the sort of enfranchised population, that's about 14 million unique individuals. Out of these, about 1.5% are politicians, so 150,000 were nominated on the ballot at any one time, and about 53,000 of them were also elected at some point in time. So that's going to be our sample. Now let me tell you about the three competence measures that we use. So from the enlistment data, we have a measure of basically of IQ of each man, the age of 18, so before the political career, that is. And it's basically a standard IQ test based on verbal, spatial, and logical abilities, scored on a 1 through to 9 standardized scale to look like a normal distribution. Now, the military are also interested in finding prospective officers, so people who have high enough scores on the cognitive ability also have a half a day with a deep interview with a psychologist. Now the contents of that, the manual is a military secret, but it is known that it involves investigating personality types like in the Big Five. So you're not looking for gung-ho fighters, but you're looking for people who can make other people cooperate with each other. That's the stated goal. So that's the leadership score that we will be using. And in fact, both the cognitive score and the leadership score have been used by labor economists to predict success in the labor market, and they are very predictive, these measures. Now, however, this does not involve women, and many politicians are women. So we want yet another measure that incorporates the best gender. So we are constructing something we call the earnings score. So this is an attempt of using the earnings data that we have through the tax records. And I should say that if someone has a full-time paid position in politics, we don't look at that data. That would be sort of circular. So we're looking at the pre-office earnings that people might have. And then essentially what we do, for those of you who are labor economists, we estimate the means of regression, i.e. a wage regression for the whole population, which is fully saturated in a number of variables. So very simply, we construct a fixed effect for your cohort, for your employment sector, i.e. your occupation, your level of education, the municipality where you live, your gender, and then we estimate your earnings on those variables and all the interactions that you can think about. So you're comparing people in very small cells given those observables. And then we take the residuals from that regression, which explains something like 55% of the variation in earnings, take the average over time, and we call that your ability or your earnings score. So it's, Eddie is not more capable than other people because he's a professor and they're a farmer. He's more capable because he's, some working in the education sector in Chicago. He's male and he's doing much better than other such people, and that's sort of the basis. We classify him as more able than other comparable people, right? So this measure is constructed in another paper, which we did in parallel. Okay, you may think that this is just a measure of economic success, and it is in a certain way, but it's also validated in the paper with Tim Besley and a couple of my other co-authors. We show that it's strongly correlated with political success as well, and in fact, municipal service delivery is strongly correlated with the competence as we measure it by this measure among leading politicians in the municipality. I don't have time to go into that now. You'll just have to believe my word for it. Okay, so are these good measures of ability? Of course, ability is very hard to measure. And, ability has different dimensions. And you can see that in this correlation matrix, where we have our three measures and years of education as well. You can see that they are positively correlated, but not perfectly so. So the highest correlation, not surprisingly, is between the cognitive score and years of education. Smarter people go more to school. The lowest correlation is between years of education and the earnings score. That's because we sort of conditioned on education when we constructed the earnings score. It's not zero because we didn't use years of education, but types of education. And otherwise, the correlation is about 0.3. So if I had to hinge my case on any one of these three measures of ability, then I would be a bit worried. But as you will see, the results that I'm going to show you are going to hold independently of which of the three measures I'm using. Now, for social background, that's also an ambiguous concept. So we're measuring it in two different ways. So one way is to measure it as an economist would. So we're looking at the income of the parents at a comparable point in time that you observe the politician. So roughly 30 years back, because that's the average age of parenthood. So we're looking at the percentiles of the income distribution, and we simply ask what percentile was your father, was your mother in the income distribution. So that's one measure. But we also use a measure such as sociologists would do it. So that's a measure of social class that's based on occupation of the parents. In particular, we're using the same measure as Goldthorpe and Erickson constructed and made famous in sociology, which is a classification into 6 social classes. Okay, so that's for starters. Let me now show you the first results. So this is a complicated graph, but one shouldn't underestimate one's audience, so let me explain this to you. And this is nothing to the data. I'm basically showing you the raw data here, okay? So let's start with the graph in the upper right-hand corner. That's for the cognitive score, all right? So these transparent bars, the broad bars, that's the population data. And as you can see, it looks like a normal distribution. That's not the coincidence. It was constructed to be that way. A Stanine scale has 20% in the middle and 4% in the extremes, and that's how it looks like, right? Now, the gray-colored bar are now the competencies of the frequencies of the different types of politicians. And we consider 4 types. So farthest to the left for each score, we have the people who have been nominated on a ballot, but they were never elected. The next category are the people who were elected to municipal council in addition to being nominated. Then the next one would be the mayors. And the fourth, and the one most to the right, would be the national parliamentarians. So these are ordered in increasing political power from nominated to elected to mayors to national parliamentarians, right? And what you can see, take a look first at the nominated. You see that everywhere below the population mean, there are fewer nominated politicians. And everywhere above the mean, there's a larger number of nominated politicians. So to say it in technical terms, we see a clean, stochastically dominating shift to the right of the distribution from the population to the nominated politicians, right? They are smarter in terms of IQ. And then you take a look at the elected politicians. So that's the next one. It's the same pattern, but everywhere below, they're below the mean, they're below the nominated. Everywhere above the mean, they're above the nominated. So that's another stochastically dominating shift to the right when you go from nominated to elected. So now you see the pattern. You go to the mayors, and you have another shift to the right. And you go to the national parliamentarians, and it's yet another shift to the right of the distribution. So for each step in political power, people are smarter than the population. And then, once you have seen this, then you can quickly scan the other ones. Here's the leadership score. Has exactly the same pattern, although it measures a different aspect of ability. And if you look at the earnings score, it looks similar. Now, this is not the raw data. Here I have done some things. This is measured in standard deviations. So, this refers to the difference towards the mean in your particular cell that I defined before. And you see that there are some people here who are 2 or 3 standard deviations out from their cell mean, and they are more often politicians than they are population participants. Okay? And here for comparison, I have also shown you the education level, and it's basically the same pattern except for the last one, which is PhD, where there are some national parliamentarians, but not many others among the politicians. Okay? So bottom line, the higher political power a person has, the smarter he or she is, and everyone is smarter than the population. Of course, population may not be the only interesting comparison. So here I'm comparing to a number of professions instead. So, and now I'm starting to sort of aggregate the data. So here we're looking only at the first moment, the mean, right? And the first 4 rows here you have already seen. It's the nominated, the elected, the mayors, and the parliamentarians. And I show you the leadership score, the cognitive score, and the earnings score. And we already know that the means are increasing in your political power, right? But here I also show you some other professions. So here I show you CEOs. CEOs in increasing economic power in the sense, for small companies, for medium-sized companies, and for larger companies. And there's a nice monotonicity among the CEOs as well. The larger your company, the smarter you are, and the more leadership score you have, and the higher your earnings score, right? I'm also showing you medical doctors. Why medical doctors? Because in Sweden, this is the sort of high status profession. So if you're any good at high school, you're expected to become a doctor. As you can see, they are the smartest here. And I show you lawyers and judges. They're pretty smart. And I also, for the intended audience of this talk, I'm showing economists and political scientists who work in a university. And they are pretty smart. Not as smart as the doctors. But they are not so good leaders. So maybe we ended up in the right place after all. So we can say that politicians, if in this kind of contrast, take the mayors, for example. They have exactly the same leadership scores and cognitive scores as CEOs of companies between 25 and 250 employees. And it's up to you to decide whether that's an interesting comparison. I think it's pretty interesting. Okay, so now we know that these people are smart, but we don't know what that reflects. It could be that it's just the elite that reproduces itself, or it could be that there's some meritocratic aspect that comes through. So that's the next question we're trying to investigate. So we're going to do two things. So to check for meritocracy, we're going to hold family background constant, and then we're going to look at whether individual traits sort of predict selection into politics. In particular, we're going to compare each politician with her own sibling, if she has one. Okay? And then we're going to check directly for family background in terms of parental income or parental social class. Let me show you first the politicians versus their siblings. So this reminds of the previous graph you saw, but it's a little different. So now in the rows, we have a particular type of politician. So in the uppercase row, we have the elected municipal politicians. In the middle row, we have the mayors. And in the lowermost row, we have the national parliamentarians. And then we have in the columns, we have the cognitive scores, the leadership scores, and the earning scores, our three favored measure of competency. So if you took a look at the uppermost row, we show the inside the population as before the transparent broad bars refer to the population. And the ones inside now refer to the siblings of the elected politicians, that's the light gray, and the politicians themselves, that's the dark gray. And if you look at this a little bit, you can see that the siblings of the politicians, for all these measures, they look pretty much like the population itself. Whereas the politicians themselves, they stick out. They are kind of smarter than the population. We already know that, but they're also smarter than their siblings. So in fact, you can make a calculation and you can ask, how large a share of the difference between the politicians and the population is explained by individual selection within the family, and that clearly depends on the measure. But for all these three measures, the answer is somewhere between 70 and 80%. So that's strongly suggestive that there is a meritocratic aspect of selection. Your individual traits are associated with your becoming a politician. And if we look at the mayors here and the sort of national parliamentarians here, the difference between the siblings and the politicians is even starker. So we have some So 3 and 2 standard deviations out people in terms of their earning score, but very few of their siblings reached that level. Okay? So it looks like meritocratic selection within the family explains who becomes a politician. Now here are some graphs that go directly for the social background, measured as the income percentile of the father. The mother, you can look at that too. It's in the online appendix to the paper, and it looks basically equivalent. So here, I'm looking at the people that are elected to a council, the mayors and the parliamentarians. And remember, I have divided the population into percentiles. Okay? So the fathers are also divided into percentiles. I'm looking at the politicians in 2011. I'm looking at their fathers 32 years before, which is when they were as old as the politicians I observe now are. The average age of a father in Sweden is 32. Okay? And so in the population, the fathers, by definition, have a distribution that is uniform with a density of 0.01 because it's percentiles, right? So to help you, I've drawn with a gray line the population distribution there and there and there. And the actual distribution of the fathers of the politician is depicted by the yellow bars. As you can see, there's no distinction between the population distribution and the sort of fathers of the politician distribution. In other words, more or less, the fathers of the politicians is a replica of the population as a whole. So in that sense, it's very representative of social background. That's true for the elected municipal politicians, but it's almost true for the mayors. Of course, we have fewer people here, so there's more jagged distribution, but by and large it's true. Almost for the parliamentarians it's true. There's a little overrepresentation at the top. At least, if we compare these people with, say, doctors or CEOs of large companies, it's a very representative background. Another way to say it is that social mobility into politics is very high. And if you look at social class rather than income of the parents, the results are similar. Okay? So now what we have learned is that politicians are smarter than the population as a whole, but they're also representative for the population as a whole in terms of social background, and they seem to be meritocratically selected. Now, this is a bit sweet. This is, so far I've shown you only the aggregate of politicians. But now let's condition on party, which party you're representing. So here are the politicians themselves, and I'm looking at 3 parties, the 3 largest parties, the Social Democrats, the Centre Party, which is a sort of agricultural interest group party, and the Conservatives. And these are the politicians themselves. They are overrepresented at high incomes. These are their own incomes. And we already know that they are smarter than the average population, so that's natural. But here we look at their fathers. And the Social Democrats are overrepresented in the middle, underrepresented at the top and the bottom. So that's the party of the middle class. The Centre Party is basically poor farmers in the rural areas. They are overrepresented at the bottom. And the Conservatives, which are sort of rich people in the cities, they are overrepresented at the top. So once you aggregate these parties together, you get the uniform distribution. But political parties do what they're supposed to do, namely represent different social classes. Now, is there a trade-off? Of course, there are limits. I cannot really answer that. So far, I've only looked at one observation, the country as a whole. But we can, and we would like to compare this to other countries, obviously, but we don't have those data yet. So we're doing a limited comparison by looking at these different municipalities. There were 300 about or so of them. So for each municipality, I compute the ability of the politicians, comparing them to the ability in that particular municipality among the population. I'm also computing a representativeness measure within each municipality, comparing it to the population of that municipality. And then I look at the distribution. And there's a spread, quite a spread, both in how smart people are relative to the population and how representative they are. And it's tempting to think that there should be some covariance there, positive covariance. In other words, if you're worse at representing social backgrounds, then you maybe do better on ability and the other way around. And that's an empirical question that we can study. So here we study it. So these are bin data. It's not every municipality, but I'm showing you for the social class measure and the income measure in terms of representativeness, and then for the three measures of ability: leadership score, cognitive score, and earning score. So it looks like a positive slope in each of these graphs, right? There is a positive slope. But if you start looking at the numbers, there are only a couple of those that are statistically significant. And when they are statistically significant, it's not so impressive. So the strongest one is actually this one, the earning score versus the income measure of social background. It has a slope of 0.15. These are standardized measures, so it means that representing the poor with one standard deviation more representativeness sort of cuts your ability by 0.15 standard deviations, and that's the strongest one we could gauge among these measures. Which it's a matter of choice, but I would say it's not very impressive. So how is that? Why isn't there a stronger trade-off? Now, this is our analysis of that question, which is sort of builds on looking at the competence measures, the cognitive score, the leadership score, and the earning score by father's income. So let's divide fathers into quartiles and study how competence co-varies with your father's income measured by quartiles. So as you can see, the population here, again with the broad transparent bars, there is some slope here. So people who have fathers that were richer are smarter as measured by IQ. Similarly with the leadership score, a little less with the earning score. So that's probably the genetic part of competence, right? So there's some inheritable part of competence. So there is slope here. People with sort of high-income fathers are smarter in the population. But now here I show you the four types of politicians that you recognize by now: the nominated, the elected, the mayors, and the parliamentarians. And here you don't see a very obvious slope. Neither do you see a very obvious slope here or here. So this means that at least in absolute terms, politicians are about as smart whether their father was in the first income quartile or whether he was in the fourth income quartile. And relatively speaking, compared to the population, actually selection is better out of the lower social backgrounds. And because of this, once you vary the social representativeness, you don't do much to ability because of this positive selection, which is particularly emphasized for people of lesser social backgrounds. Finally, let me say a few words about the drivers. So what are the drivers we study? Well, obviously there are supply factors. Who is going to self-select into politics? And we're going to look for material as well as pro-social motives to select yourself into politics. The other side is the demand side. People come and say, I want to be a politician. They become a party member. So how do the parties screen those willing politicians? We've already seen that the more power people have, the smarter they are. So it seems that there is positive screening by political parties because the Swedish system is very party-based. So let me study that a little bit. Now, in the paper, which is going to appear, we have two editors. One is a finance economist and one is a labor economist. They didn't particularly like our little model that we have, so now it appears in the online appendix. But since I have command over you, I can talk a little bit about the model. It helps our thinking about the issue. So we construct a simple ROI model of selection of people, right? So imagine that there's a bunch of risk-neutral citizens who may offer themselves for political service. And each person is characterized by an ability, we call it Y, and a pro-social motive for serving in politics, we call that P, and the population is just a distribution across these two parameters. Now, each person has a 2-period horizon, and then, your life is very simple. Outside politics, you just earn your ability in first period, and you expect to earn gamma times Y in the second period, where gamma is a sort of measure of the age earnings profile. You improve your earnings over time by gamma, a number above 1. Inside politics, you come to the party. You're selected to be on an electable seat with probability Q of Y, so that's a screening function that depends on your ability. And you get an intrinsic benefit P over 2 per period if you get elected. So you get to serve, you get your intrinsic motive. But in politics, you must give up some private career. So that's going to these meetings. You don't show up at work all the time. So there's some depreciation. So instead of gamma times Y in the second period, you get 1 minus delta. So delta is the depreciation from being a politician of your career, right? But then there's a tournament prize. You can become the mayor in the second period of life. And there is a probability pi that you become the mayor and you earn that 1% highest wage in the income distribution. We call that W. And in the data, we're going to sort of associate the gamma with occupation-specific age earnings profile. And we're going to look for municipal-specific mayoral wages. And we're going to look for party municipality-specific probabilities to get elected. Now, the rest is plain sailing. You just set up the cost-benefit calculus and you compute the conditions on your parameters to become a politician. And the bottom line is that your pro-social benefit P, in order for you to go into politics, must outweigh the expected material cost of being a politician, which is your opportunity cost minus the expected capital gain of winning the mayorship, right? And then we can do comparative statics, and the prediction is very simple. It says that if P and Y are drawn from a joint distribution, then a higher mayoral wage, higher probability of getting it, and the lower age earnings profile raises the average and marginal ability of those who are self-selecting into politics. And if we have positive party screening, this also applies in equilibrium. So now I'm going to show you, for each of these comparative statics, one picture. So this looks at the association between the mayoral wage, which varies across municipalities, and abilities. And we just run a regression. There's no causality here, just an association. So 4 people at different ballot ranks, so this is the first ballot rank, does a higher wage for the mayor relative to the average wage induce a higher ability politicians to serve? Yes, it does, for the cognitive score and the leadership score. And it does for the earnings score as well, actually the first and the second position on the ballot. So there's a correlation like the model predicts. There is a material motive for selecting into politics. This graph shows you the age earnings profile associations. So here we're looking at occupation-specific age earnings profile. We can compute that from the registered data. So we know the average earnings increase for each occupation, and we plot that at the horizontal axis. Right? And then here I show you one example, the cognitive score index, but now by profession. So take this dot, I'm looking at medical doctors. They have a very good average earnings profile. And here are the medical doctors who are in politics relative to all medical doctors. How do they compare? So that's the point on the regression line. And actually, here you see it's a negative number on the vertical axis, which just in plain words, the doctor you see in politics is worse than the doctor you see at the clinic in terms of cognitive score. He has a high opportunity cost. That's what the model said. Look at the engineers. Their earnings don't grow as fast, and they are better relative to other engineers, the politicians in engineering. They are positive, but barely positive. And take this point also on the regression line. A kindergarten teacher with a university education are unfortunate when it comes to private earnings growth, but they are very well selected relative to the population of that occupation when they become politicians. My time is up. I get a sign, so I'm not going to show you this. This table basically tells you that there is better selection if mayorship is more likely, but there's no way you can understand these data unless you appeal to pro-social motives, because even in places where there's a zero probability to become a politician, the politicians are better than the population, and that can only happen if they are pro-socially motivated. This graph, which I don't have time to explain, shows that parties not only screen by putting people, smarter people on electable seats relative to nominated seats, also within the elected seats, there is a positive slope in people's ability, however you measure it. So I have to wrap up. I've tried to tell you that Swedish politicians are positively selected by whichever ability measure you like, more so the higher their political power. I have told you that they are representative for all socioeconomic groups. And it seems, in other words, that broad social representation is not very costly in terms of ability. And my co-authors from Berkeley, who have a background in Brazil and Argentina, they keep telling me that this is an inclusive meritocracy. More hesitant to use those words, but anyway, that's their labeling. So clearly, this is just like a stepping stone. We need to know more about the mechanism behind this selection. We need to know the so what question, okay? Competence and representativeness, how does it map into to policy outcomes? And of course, we like to know how representative this is of other countries. We're trying to do this now for Finland. We're trying to do it for Brazil. We'll have to see how it works out. But data is an important constraint. Sorry for taking all this time. Thank you.
Professor Persson, please stay because we have Professor Zhang to give you a souvenir for the lecture.
Okay.
Thank you.